In this video, we will learn about 12 different types of bias, which can skew reality, change the results of research, and give us false information about the world. I'll give examples of each, and we will better learn how to spot these sources of error in our daily lives, so we can all gain skill in separating fact from fiction, or, as we say here, separating health from hoax. Welcome to Health or Hoax, the show that empowers people to make informed choices about their own health by taking a critical look at research on popular healthcare claims. Everything in this show is meant to inspire critical thinking rather than pretending that we have the one and only valid perspective. We are healthcare students and we're on a journey for truth. We're looking to make it easier for you to understand if the fads, diets, and treatments that you're being sold are health or hoax. So here we go. Who doesn't love being right about stuff? Rubbing the words, "I told you so," in the faces of the doubters and haters who said, "You couldn't do it," carries with it a sweet sense of satisfaction. When we see an article here or a headline there which supports the opinions we already had, we tend to love it. What a fantastic article! Huzzah! Hooray! Yet, let's say you've decided to ignore science on, climate change because you think that it's fake. Well, now, every time that you see an article or headline on climate change, you're going to ignore it, you're going to hate it, and almost certainly you'll never actually read it. You'll wait and wait and wait a little more until one day you see an article that confirms your bias, and then you like it and share it and bookmark it so every time anyone brings up climate change, you can cite the one and the only article that supports your stance on the issue. We all have this tendency to some extent, so pay attention to the way that you think about articles that you agree with versus the ones you don't. Are you more critical of things that you don't already believe in? Are you less likely to be skeptical of the things that confirm beliefs you already have? Our next type of bias is the observer expectancy bias. Basically, this is when a researcher in an experiment unconsciously informs the test subjects of the nature of the experiment. In a blind study, the subjects will not be aware whether they're receiving treatment or a placebo. Ideally, the person giving out the treatment to the subjects is also blind and doesn't know who is in the experimental group and who is just getting a sugar pill. However, sometimes studies are only single blind, meaning the doctor, in this case, does know if they are giving a real treatment or a fake treatment. This is a problem because the doctor may take on body language or speech patterns which accidentally reveal to the subject that they aren't getting a real treatment. Oh no! Abort! Abort the mission! Well, hold on. Some types of healthcare treatments are simply impossible to have a double-blind study for. You simply cannot give a convincing placebo. Or if you can, then the doctor or clinician simply has to be aware of whether they're giving the treatment or not. So it can't be blinded. For example, if you tried to give a placebo or, a fake treatment in an acupuncture trial, the acupuncturist doing the procedure is gonna know which group they're treating or not treating, as the case may be. And they may accidentally, unconsciously give away that information somehow. You can't fully eliminate this type of bias, so just be aware of whether this is happening in a piece of research or an experiment that you're reading about. You know that one child in every family who everybody thinks is a little angel and they can do no wrong? But you know better. You've seen them behind the scenes and seen their horns and little devil's tail while they're skulking around in the shadows after hours. And you wonder, how in the hell does nobody else see this side of them? Well, this is the halo effect. Basically, You put a halo around people, and it metaphorically blinds you from finding any fault in their behavior whatsoever. Many public figures who have been revealed recently as criminals or sex offenders are being defended still by people who just can't see past the halo that they've placed around them. Think about it. You spend your whole life, your childhood, your angsty teenage years, through the good times and the bad, looking up to a person like, I don't know, Bill Cosby. And decades later, it comes to light that, oh no, he's a sexual offender? They call him a criminal, but you know him as a wholesome family entertainer, really part of the family. Surely everybody's got to be mistaken about him, right? Well, we are all a little bit inclined to ignore the faults and mistakes of people that we like, while being a little bit more harsh and critical of the people that we don't. Hey, real quick, comment below with a bias that you've seen people in your life displaying most often, or tell us about a time that you were influenced by one of the biases that we're talking about today. A selection bias is when the sample selected for an experiment fails to be chosen randomly. What if you wanted to, I don't know, figure out what types of vitamins are in fruits, on average, so that you could evaluate the question of how many servings a day should a person have of fruit? Well, we would need to look at the nutritional contents of lots and lots of different kinds of fruits, because you never know what kinds of fruit people are actually eating on their plate. So when you say you should eat 1 cup of fruit, we're actually taking into account, well, a bowl of fruit that might have some apples, some oranges, maybe some berries, some bananas, and some other things. If for the experiment, we basically mashed down fruit into fruit smoothies and then measured how much sugar and vitamins and enzymes and stuff is in that smoothie, we would want to take a random sampling of fruits. If it wasn't random, we may accidentally end up with just a banana smoothie. Oh no! No berries! No apples! None of it! So the conclusions that we drew from that would not be true about all fruits in a random bowl of fruit. It would only be true about bananas. This is why it's important to have a random sampling that's representative of the population, in this case, the fruit population. Next up, everyone loves groupthink, so join the hive mind, jump on the bandwagon. All the cool kids are doing it. For better or worse, we trust something when other people trust it too. Well, how many stars did it get on Google? 3 stars? Psh, next. Oh, the Democrats decided their frontrunner is gonna be some troll I don't actually like, even though I really loved one of the other candidates? Well, screw it, it's better than the alternative. I'll still vote for them even if I don't like them, since the group of the political party has decided it, and I identify as part of that group, so I'm jumping on the bandwagon. We tend to trust large numbers of people as though somehow the sheer volume of people who hold a certain belief somehow reflects the validity of that belief. Well, I've got news for you. Even 1 billion people can be wrong. Next up is the anchoring bias. The anchoring bias describes the tendency to believe the first thing that we hear as being more reliable than information we hear later on. A simple and common example is that people born into families of a certain religion will tend to grow up to be members of that same religion. And generally, they'll think that their religion is somehow, in some way, more valid than other religions. However, hypothetically, if they had been born in a different part of the world and into a different religion, well, they'd probably feel the same way about that one, simply because they were exposed to it first. In reality, it's quite possible that neither religion is any better or worse than the other, but that whichever one you heard of first is the one you are more likely to think is correct. Next, a clustering illusion is when we see patterns in places where they don't really exist. A popular example is in astrology, When we draw out constellations in the night sky, we literally connect the dots. Most people are going to be familiar with the 12 constellations and certain specific animals that are drawn amongst the stars, like a lion or a scorpion. You may not realize that there are, cultures all over the world who have placed constellations in similar locations, yet they connected the dots a little bit differently. And they drew different animals which maybe they were accustomed to seeing. All of these patterns are really just a trick that our mind plays on us called Apophenia, which again is just the tendency to see patterns in things where there is no real connection. Another fantastic example of apophenia is the Rorschach ink blot test. A person is shown a random looking splotch of ink on a paper and asked, "What do you see?" You'll find that while looking at the very same blot of ink, one person will see a face, another sees two dancing people, and yet another person sees a flower. We make up patterns and draw conclusions from them, even though there aren't any real connections to be made. The ink blot is just random. Next is a reporting bias. Reporting bias is important to consider when you hear statements like, "Well, all the research says blah, blah, blah," because maybe they're right. Maybe all the research does say that, at least all the research that was actually published. But what about the research that wasn't published? Was it not published because it was bad? Well, maybe not. Oftentimes, research that doesn't show strong positive results doesn't get published at all, because even though the research itself may be very well done and the conclusions that they did reach might be actually very trustworthy indeed, many papers simply won't get published because the research has conclusions like, "No significant difference between drug X and drug Y was found." That's boring. Nobody wants to read it, and nobody wants to pay for it. It's like if you saw a new superhero movie called Neutral Man, or more like non-binary person because it's neutral, but neutral person. And after much conflict with their arch rival, Dr. Ambivalent, the thrilling saga concludes with them going out for a cup of lukewarm tea and dry biscuits and setting their differences aside for a nice, uneventful evening. Ugh, nobody wants to see that. And nobody wants to read research that ends with, "We don't know." But guess what? A lot of research ends with, "We don't know," and it never gets published at all. Framing. It's how data is perceived based on how it is framed, either in a positive or a negative light. For example, if you took a 10-ounce glass and filled it with 5 ounces of water, well, depending on if someone says something like, "Look how much is gone," versus, "Look how much is left," you will think that the glass is either half empty or half full. The objective truth, of course, is simply that the glass is at 50% of its capacity. Next up is a self-serving bias, and this is something we all have a little bit of. We want to attribute our successes to how awesome we are, but attribute our failures to how unfair the circumstances or life is. Like, if you get an A on your test, it's because you're awesome and you studied your tail off. But when you fail the next test, it's because your teacher sucks. Well, this is important to consider when evaluating a scientific claim or a healthcare treatment, because the doctors who come up with new and, in their opinions, innovative treatments are more likely to feel that, well, if it works, it's because the treatment is awesome. But if their experiment fails, they blame it on bad experimentation or just random chance. They gotta do it again. They are committed to serving their own self-interests and preserving their self-worth. Conflicts of interest are very common. Take, for example, if the person who did that coffee is good research also happened to own a major coffee company, while the person who was doing the coffee is bad research, maybe they own a tea company. And they might actually benefit financially if the people stopped drinking coffee and switched to tea. This is really common in alternative healthcare techniques and gadgets. Like if I invented a new fancy massage tool that you could use, and I was the one who did the research about that tool, and then I came to the conclusion that, quote, "This tool will reduce your anxiety and depression for the low, low price of giving up your critical thinking skills and being willing to believe anything I tell ya." Well, needless to say, you should watch out for that because it's all over the place. And you should always check a person's sources to see exactly where did they get this information that they're using to make their claims. Did they do the research themselves? Especially if somebody's trying to sell you something. People make mistakes. It's only human. An experimenter bias is when the person carrying out the experiment makes a mistake, and unfortunately it leads to bias in the results. This could be an error in actually measuring something, like rounding up if you expect favorable results, or making errors in your calculations, or maybe throwing out what you consider to be bad data, which might also be just data that doesn't support your conclusion. Or really any other bias that's introduced by researchers themselves into the experiment. If you were testing to see if eating spinach really makes your muscles big and strong like Popeye the Sailor Man, you might subconsciously round up on all the measurements you take of people's big old biceps. And this might end up making it look like spinach is doing much more than it really is. To overcome this, the people who are taking the measurements in the experiment would need to be blind of the purpose of the study and as to which group is the control group and which group is the spinach group. Today we learned about biases, which alter our perception of the world and influence our beliefs without us even knowing it. Armed with the power of knowledge, we can battle our tendency to fall into the traps of these common biases. Some of the most common biases that you're going to encounter in your life, and which dramatically influence your beliefs and attitudes about the world, are confirmation bias, which tells us that we love to confirm the beliefs that we already have, and that we tend to ignore evidence of opposing viewpoints, even when that evidence is actually pretty good. We learned about the framing effect, and depending on how a company or news source frames an issue, we may see that issue as being either good or bad, like a glass half full or half empty. We also explored the power of groupthink and how we love to jump on bandwagons, how we tend to see patterns everywhere, even when there aren't any, how we tend to blindly believe the first thing that we hear over information that we learn later on. And we learned about several other biases that can alter the results of experimental studies. Take time to notice the way that you respond to new information, conflicting beliefs, family debates, and how and why you either embrace or reject certain ideas about the world. Please comment below and tell us which bias you tend to fall into the most. Love to hear about that. Hit subscribe, and down here there's a little bell, and once you hit that button you'll see it. And it's going to turn on notifications, so every time we release a new video you're going to get an alert and you can see it right away. And don't forget to always remember our word is not the law, so add to the discussion below and join us next time on Health or Hoax.